The Physical and Environmental Planning Sector Subcommittee, also known as the PEPSIC, was re-engaged through the financial support of the Targeted Support to CDEMA Project. What is the significance of this subcommittee's work for advancing CDM in the region?
So the Physical and Environmental Planning Sector Subcommittee is one of 7 subcommittees of the CDM Coordination and Harmonization Council. And those 7 subcommittees have 3 basic roles. One of them being to discuss the work and programs and projects that they have that are advancing comprehensive disaster management in the sector, and in this case, in the physical and environmental planning sector. So that's the built environment on infrastructure and resilience. Also to harmonize our efforts so that we don't duplicate effort. We want to ensure that we maximize our resources. We have limited resources in the region, and any resources coming to this region, we want to ensure that we are not, duplicating. Also, we want to ensure that we monitor and evaluate how we're progressing on achieving the results of the comprehensive disaster management strategy in the area of physical and environmental planning. Now, in the physical and environmental planning sector, the CDM strategy speaks to priority number 3. And in that priority, it highlights some specific priorities for the region, and some of those relate to incentivizing how we reduce risk as it results to risk in the infrastructure in our Caribbean region, how we also plan for that, so the number of sector plans that we have, and also it looks to see how we are exactly monitoring our progress towards achieving these results. So this sector is of course very important because it's a space where our development partners can discuss what they're doing, but also our regional institutions. So for example, the membership of this committee includes the Caribbean Planners Association, it includes the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, the Engineers Council, the Architects Council. We have the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. They do very important work on environment and resilience. We also have the university, CERMES, University of the West Indies sits on the committee. And this committee, I would have mentioned the Caribbean Planners Association, but that's one of the co-chairs, and the other co-chair is the Organization of American States. So these are some of the key players, and we want to ensure that we know what each other is doing, and we are able to work together towards achieving a common goal and common results.
Tell me about the CRCP 10-2023 Building Guideline, which was developed in 2024, and how it will make a difference to the future of safer building.
Okay, CRCP 10-2023 is the Regional Code of Practice for the Construction of Houses. This is a building guideline. We do have building standards. So OACS has a building standard from 2017. Then we also have Jamaica has their standard, Bahamas has a standard. These building guidelines are important because building standards are sometimes hard to understand, and they're at a very high level. We recognize that about 70% of the construction of houses in our Caribbean is built by the informal building sector. And we need to have the information in a way that can be easily understood. So this was the birth of the building guideline. It came out of work that CDEMA, Caribbean Disaster Emergency Response Agency, had started back in 2005 with the Organization of American States. And one of the calls then was that we should standardize, we should make it a standard. And so we took that advice on board, and we worked with the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, who has the authority to develop standards, to actually develop this code of practice for the construction of houses. Now, the code of practice for the construction of houses was approved by the Council for Trade and Economic Development, that is COTED, CARICOM, last year in June. And so it's important for us to really ensure that across the region we can adopt it. I wanted to highlight that because it came out of the 2017, we had Maria, which was very destructive in Dominica and many other Caribbean countries. And we realized that it was important to really come back to this priority because the housing sector in particular gets hard hit every time we have these major disasters, and sometimes it doesn't even take a major disaster, Category 5, like Maria or Irma, for the roofs to come off, for people to be homeless. And so we wanted to ensure that we had something to point to that incorporated the latest information So we do have building standards that are available in the region, but they don't give us the guidance for building to category 5 storms. And in this case, we are building to the winds that we would have experienced for Dorian, which was very impactful in the Bahamas. And also we had Irma and Maria to learn from. So the lessons learned from that in terms of, how we can improve how we build is incorporated in this new building guideline, which not only gives guidelines for winds, which will be hurricanes, for example, but also for earthquake magnitude 7 earthquakes, because Haiti would have been decimated in certain parts and so on. So we want to learn and provide the latest and best information to our Caribbean, and CRCP 10-2023 does just that.
An Integrity and Safety in Residential Construction webinar series was hosted in September 2024 for key stakeholders like engineers, artisans, and architects from across the region. What were some notable outcomes of this webinar series?
Well, we had a very good response at the webinar series. It was called Integrity and Safety for Residential Construction, and we wanted to discuss CRCP 10-2023 in the context of building standards. So we recognize OECS has building standards and these other countries have building standards. We wanted to ensure it was relevant to all countries. And so when we marketed it, we marketed it from the perspective we just had Beryl in end of June into July, right? And this webinar series came off then in September. We were actually planning to have it in July, but we weren't able to because we were dealing with the response to Beryl and all that. But by the time we came up with the advertising for this, we did some very direct marketing in 8 pilot countries that we are targeting for training in the actual code of practice for the construction of houses. We've actually developed training material based off of the standard. So again, this is now breaking down the information to CBQ level, which is competency-based training, where actually you're checking to see if people are able to do the work. You just don't want head knowledge, but they have to demonstrate that they can do the work. And the response was excellent, not necessarily only from artisans, but contractors and architects, because the information that we're providing is based on the latest information that we would have had. Our consultant who would have worked on this, he was able to demonstrate that we do have a trend where we are getting more and more category 5 hurricanes, right? And so we can't be building for the past, we got to build for the future, and it's a significant investment.
Following the 10th meeting of the PEPSIC in September 2024, what are some key next steps to continue the work of championing safer building in the Caribbean?
For the 10th Physical and Environmental Planning Sector Subcommittee meeting, we had some major objectives. We invited the planner, the chief planner from St. Vincent and the Grenadines and from Grenada to tell us firsthand, what were some of their needs, what were the impacts, what are some of the needs. What we realized in planning the PEPSI webinar, we had all these agencies working together towards pulling off this webinar, because each body was responsible for a session, responsible for getting speakers out, and we really recognized that we could do something great together, and that gave us momentum to see what else could we do together. And sometimes we think we need a whole lot of resources to get things done, but really and truly what we were able to do is leverage the technical expertise and the different organizations that are on the PEPSI, and we realized, we could do more. And so at the 10th PEPSI, what we were thinking about is what could be some of the low-hanging fruits, what could we do with what we had, and then maybe what could be some bigger things that we may need some more resources for. So in listening to St. Vincent and the Grenadines and listening to Grenada in terms of some of their needs, what we were able to identify is, for example, they need people to come in with technical expertise to help with the planning, the recovery and things of this sort. And for example, our co-chair CPA, even though they don't have money, they have a network that they're saying, like, we can tap into this network to give you support. OAS, for example, identified that we can, do some convening of some of the policymakers and so on, because we recognize that we do have, even if the basic building code was being applied in countries, we would be a far ways. but we do have issues with surveillance. We do have issues with ensuring that people do what they are supposed to do. There's no mandatory requirement for building codes to be utilized in the countries. And so if there's nothing really saying I have the authority that this is required, if you don't really understand why aren't people doing it? We had ministers, we had like people that were in terms of policy making participate in the webinars, and some of the things we realized is that you need to help those who cannot help themselves. So what we were able to do is to see, okay, which resources can we leverage from our membership? We have the architects, they're willing to, for example, come into the country afterwards and help with the longer term recovery effort and planning. And so we identified those areas. We also identified some areas that we could improve to advance with the actual surveillance and to actually what would be needed to update some of the standards and so on. So we identified some key areas. Another one that I would highlight from Prosecute's perspective is that we realized that the quality of material, that building material that we have in the region is substandard sometimes. Like what people are actually using to put on their roof, that could be used for, livestock or something like this, but not really for your roof because it's so thin, it's like almost like paper. So if you put a screw in that or a nail, is what people use, it's gonna just rip right off. So we do want to ensure that we get a certain standard, a certain quality of material, and that there are checks to ensure that we are getting what that material says that it is, to actually measure. So CRCP, for example, would have identified that they are willing to work in this area of metrology in the region to help with ensuring that we have those quality materials. We also recognize we need to work with those who are supplying materials, because you need to have demand. Like the suppliers, those who are bringing in the materials, need to understand what is required, because we can say what is required in the building guideline, this kind of material and whatever screw is needed and whatever, but if it's not available in the country, then people still can't, build to those guidelines. So we identified some of those low-hanging fruit that we thought, we could do this as a committee. And we also considered the broader plan that UKFCDO, they have developed this roadmap for resilience infrastructure in the region, and discuss, how could we support that, what would be necessary to make that really functional in our Caribbean region. So these were some of the areas that would have been discussed. And we now need to move forward in terms of starting to implement some of these things. So I think those are some of the key priorities for us. What we also recognize is that there is the CDM strategy, and there is the Caribbean Pathway to Resilience. And in the Caribbean Pathway to Resilience, it also talks about safeguarding infrastructure. And ahead of the game, really, we looked at that Caribbean Pathway for Resilience to see what are those areas related to this committee. And we decided that we would want to set up a working group that would focus on resilience, for the physical resilience specifically. And we have a terms of reference for that. So one of our next steps will be to launch that committee to further advance in from a broader perspective, where we need to go as a region, and to have a plan. We can't do everything at the same time, but at least in the first 3 years or so, what could we seek to achieve?
Thank you so much, Dr. Greenidge, for your time.
You're welcome.